Beneath the center of one of the largest cities in the world, under the cathedral and the government palace and the main square where people walk their dogs on Sunday mornings, there is another city. The city below is approximately 7 centuries old. It was built on an island in a lake, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, supplied by an aqueduct and by a network of canals that functioned as streets. At its height, it was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world in the early 16th century, comparable to London and Paris of the same period and larger than most of the cities of Renaissance Europe. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived there in 1519 described it in letters to the King of Spain in terms that made clear they had seen nothing like it in their experience of the European world. Within 2 years of that arrival, the city was destroyed. The siege and the fighting that ended the Aztec Empire in 1521 reduced the great city of Tenochtitlan to rubble and ash, and the conquerors, with a specific logic of replacement that was both practical and symbolic, used the stones of the ancient buildings to construct the new city of Mexico on top of the ruins. The cathedral went up over the foundations of the great temple. The government palace was built where the palace of the Emperor Moctezuma had stood. The main square was paved over the central precinct of the ceremonial district. And the city that had been called Tenochtitlan became the city that is called Mexico City, built on the bones of its predecessor in a way that both preserved and obscured the ancient structure beneath. The archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan is therefore not the archaeology of a lost city in a desert or a jungle. It is the archaeology of a city that lies directly beneath a living metropolis of more than 20 million people, accessible only in fragments, through construction excavations and deliberate archaeological projects, in the spaces that the modern city permits. Tonight we go down through those layers to find what is still there. The layers are real, and they are deep, and they are rich. The archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan is among the most productive and most challenging urban archaeology anywhere in the world, and the picture it is producing of the ancient city is one that continues to expand with each new season of work and each new application of scientific methods to the evidence already recovered. The specific character of what is being recovered, piece by piece, from beneath the streets of Mexico City, is the material evidence of a civilization that the conquest attempted to erase but did not entirely succeed in erasing. Each carved stone, each offering cache, each fragment of the ancient urban fabric that the archaeology exposes is a piece of a picture that is becoming more complete with each edition, and the picture it is producing of the ancient city is one that deserves the sustained attention that it is only now beginning to receive. The Aztec Empire, whose capital Tenochtitlan was, is among the more remarkable political and cultural achievements in the history of the pre-Columbian Americas. The people who are commonly called the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, and their empire is more properly called the Triple Alliance, a political confederation of 3 city-states centered on the Lake District of the Basin of Mexico that at its height controlled territory from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific and from what is now central Mexico to the borders of modern Guatemala. The Triple Alliance was not simply a large territorial state in the manner of many Old World empires. It was a specific kind of hegemonic system in which the 3 allied city-states extracted tribute from a large number of subject polities while allowing those polities considerable internal autonomy. The tribute system, which required subject communities to deliver specific quantities of goods to the Triple Alliance capitals on a regular schedule, was the economic foundation of the empire and the mechanism through which the enormous material wealth visible in Tenochtitlan was generated. The Mexica were relative latecomers to the Basin of Mexico. Their own accounts of their history describe a period of wandering from a northern homeland called Aztlan, and they arrived in the Lake District in the early 14th century as a subordinate group looking for a place to settle. Their settlement on the island in Lake Texcoco in 1325, later dated to that year by their own historical tradition, was the founding moment of Tenochtitlan, and the subsequent history of the city across less than 2 centuries before the Spanish conquest is one of the more dramatic examples of rapid political ascent in the pre-Columbian world. The specific character of the Mexica political and religious tradition, with its emphasis on warfare, human sacrifice, and the maintenance of cosmic order through the provision of blood to the sun, gave the Aztec Empire a distinctive ideological character that shaped both its internal organization and its external relationships with the peoples it dominated. The specific cosmological framework within which the Aztec ritual tradition operated was sophisticated and internally consistent, and the specific practices that the Spanish observers found most alien and most disturbing, including the public human sacrifice at the summit of the Great Pyramids, were embedded in a theological tradition that understood them as necessary acts of cosmic maintenance rather than as gratuitous violence. Understanding the Aztec world requires engaging with this theological framework on its own terms rather than simply judging it by the standards of a different tradition. With its emphasis on warfare, human sacrifice, and the maintenance of cosmic order through the provision of blood to the sun, gave the Aztec Empire a distinctive ideological character that shaped both its internal organization and its external relationships with the peoples it dominated. Whether the scale of human sacrifice in the Aztec world was as large as the Spanish sources claimed, and how it is to be understood within the specific cosmological framework of the Mexica tradition, are questions that continue to generate scholarly debate, but the practice was real and was central to the religious and political life of the empire. The landscape of the Basin of Mexico, in which Tenochtitlan was built, is among the more dramatically altered landscapes in the history of human settlement. The Basin of Mexico is a high plateau surrounded by mountains, sitting at an elevation of approximately 2,200 meters above sea level. When the Mexica arrived in the 14th century, the basin was occupied by a complex of lakes. Lake Texcoco at the center, flanked by Lake Zaltican and Lake Zumpango to the north and Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco to the south. The total area of the lake complex was enormous, covering perhaps 1,000 square kilometers at its maximum extent, and the surrounding landscape of mountains and forests gave the basin a visual drama that travelers and settlers consistently described in terms that conveyed the specific quality of the high-altitude light and the enclosed geography. The island on which Tenochtitlan was built lay in the southwestern portion of Lake Texcoco, separated from the western shore by approximately 3 kilometers of open water. The choice of an island location was partly determined by the political circumstances of the Mexica arrival. The mainland around the lake was already controlled by established polities that did not welcome the newcomers, and the island, which was uninhabited because it was subject to flooding, was one of the few locations where the Mexica could establish a settlement without immediate conflict. The specific religious significance that the Mexica attributed to the island, where their patron deity Huitzilopochtli had indicated they should settle through the specific sign of an eagle perched on a cactus, gave the geographical necessity a cosmological justification that became one of the founding narratives of the empire. The engineering challenge of building a major city on an island in a lake, and of expanding that island as the city grew, was one that the Mexica addressed with a combination of practical ingenuity and organized labor that produced results of considerable scale. The specific hydraulic engineering required to manage the water levels of the lake around the island, including the great dike built by the Emperor Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco across the lake to control the salinity of the water on the western side, was an achievement comparable to the major hydraulic works of any ancient civilization. The management of the lake water, which combined fresh water from springs and streams with the more saline water of the main lake basin, required a sustained program of engineering maintenance that was one of the primary responsibilities of the imperial administration, and of expanding that island as the city grew, was one that the Mexica addressed with a combination of practical ingenuity and organized labor that produced results of considerable scale. The construction of causeways connecting the island to the mainland, the development of the Chinampa system of artificial agricultural islands in the shallow lake margins, and the extension of the island itself through the systematic filling of the adjacent lake shallows with excavated material and building rubble transformed the original small island into the large urban area of the mature Tenochtitlan. The lake system that surrounded Tenochtitlan and that gave it its specific character as an island city has been almost entirely drained. The systematic drainage of the Basin of Mexico lakes, which began in the colonial period and continued through the 20th century, has converted the lake bed into the flat urban plain on which the sprawling modern city of Mexico City now stands. The specific ecological and archaeological consequences of this drainage are immense. The lake sediments that once protected the archaeological remains of the ancient city have been destabilized by the drainage, causing the ongoing subsidence of the modern city that is one of Mexico City's most serious urban problems. And the ancient remains that survive beneath the modern streets are in a hydrogeological environment very different from the one in which they were deposited. The Spanish accounts of Tenochtitlan, written by the conquistadors who saw it in 1519 and 1520, are among the most extraordinary descriptions of a city in the literature of early modern exploration. Hernán Cortés, the commander of the Spanish expedition, wrote a series of letters to the Spanish king Charles I describing his journey from the Gulf Coast to the Aztec capital and his experiences in the city itself. His account of the first sight of Tenochtitlan from the mountain pass above the basin, looking down at the lake with its island city and its causeways in the early morning light, is among the more memorable passages in the literature of the conquest. A description of a city whose scale and whose organization exceeded anything in the European experience of the early 16th century. The specific details that Cortés and his companions provided about the city are remarkable for their specificity and their evident astonishment. They describe the great market of Tlatelolco, the sister city to Tenochtitlan on the northern part of the same island, which they estimated to contain 60,000 buyers and sellers on a daily basis. The specific comparison that the Spanish visitors made between the Tlatelolco market and the markets of the European cities they knew, which consistently concluded that the Aztec market was larger and better organized than anything in Europe, is one of the more striking pieces of evidence for the scale of the pre-Columbian urban economy of Mesoamerica. The specific estimation of 60,000 daily participants, if even approximately accurate, would make the Tlatelolco market one of the largest commercial venues in the world in the early 16th century, are remarkable for their specificity and their evident astonishment. They describe the great market of Tlatelolco, the sister city to Tenochtitlan on the northern part of the same island, which they estimated to contain 60,000 buyers and sellers on a daily basis, organized into specific sections for specific categories of goods: food, cloth, ceramics, metalwork, featherwork, animals, slaves, and dozens of other categories. They describe the great temple complex at the center of the city, where the twin temples to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc rose above the surrounding ceremonial precinct. They describe the causeways, wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, and the canals that served as streets between the blocks of buildings. The description by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the common soldiers who accompanied the expedition and who wrote his account decades later in old age, is in many ways the most vivid and the most human of the Spanish sources. Where Cortés wrote as a commander describing a political and military situation, Diaz wrote as an ordinary man describing an experience of wonder and disorientation. His account of the first arrival in Tenochtitlan, of the sensory experience of a city unlike anything he had previously encountered, of the specific smells and sounds and visual impressions of the Aztec capital, is one of the most affecting first-person accounts of cultural encounter in the history of exploration literature. These Spanish descriptions are invaluable, but they must be read with an awareness of the specific perspective of their authors and the specific purposes for which they were written. Cortés was writing to justify his unauthorized expedition and to claim his share of the conquest's rewards. Diaz was writing to claim his place in the history of the conquest and to assert the importance of the ordinary soldiers whose contribution the later histories had minimized. Both were writing from the perspective of the conquerors, and the picture of Tenochtitlan they provide, however vivid and however detailed, is the picture of people who were already planning to replace what they described. The physical form of Tenochtitlan, reconstructed from the combination of Spanish accounts, Aztec pictorial manuscripts, and archaeological evidence, was unlike any other city of its period. The island city was organized around a ceremonial precinct at its center, a roughly rectangular enclosed area of approximately 300 by 400 meters that contained the principal temples and ritual structures of the Mexica state religion. The Great Temple, the Templo Mayor, stood at the center of this precinct, a stepped pyramid approximately 55 meters high, supporting two temples at its summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the solar war deity and patron of the Mexica, and one to Tlaloc, the rain deity whose favor was essential for the agricultural productivity that sustained the empire. The specific dual dedication of the Templo Mayor, combining the solar war deity and the rain deity in a single structure, encoded the specific ideological synthesis of warfare and agriculture that characterized the Aztec state. The causeways that connected the island to the mainland were major engineering achievements. Three main causeways ran to the north, the south, and the west, each several kilometers long and wide enough to accommodate the large volume of people and goods that moved through them daily. The causeways incorporated removable sections that could be used to control the flow of water between different parts of the lake system, managing the salinity and the flood levels of the different lake basins. Aqueducts ran alongside the causeways, carrying fresh water from springs on the mainland to the island city, whose own lake water was too saline for drinking or agriculture. The Chinampas, the artificial agricultural islands constructed in the shallow lake margins to the south of the main island, were the agricultural foundation of the city. These elongated raised fields, constructed by layering vegetation, mud, and lake sediments between channels that allowed water to circulate, were one of the most productive agricultural systems in the pre-Columbian world. The specific combination of the lacustrine environment, the controlled water supply, and the intensive cultivation of multiple annual crops gave the Chinampa system a productivity per unit area that dwarfed the dryland agriculture of the mainland, and the specific landscape of the Chinampas, with their channels and their willow trees and their floating flowers, was one of the features of the Tenochtitlan world that most struck the Spanish visitors. The residential areas of the island city were organized in four main districts, each associated with a specific patron deity, and within each district the buildings ranged from the elaborate stone compounds of the nobility to the more modest residences of the commoner population, with a diversity of construction quality and household wealth that reflected the social hierarchy of the Aztec world. The specific visual character of the ancient city, as the Spanish accounts convey it, was defined by the combination of the white plastered surfaces of the buildings, the color of the ritual and decorative painting that covered many of those surfaces, and the specific quality of the high-altitude light that illuminated them. The visual world of Tenochtitlan, with its ceremonial processions and its market crowds and its pyramid temples rising above the surrounding buildings, was not the gray ruinscape of the modern archaeological site. It was a vivid and specific urban environment whose specific aesthetic character is recoverable only through the combination of the surviving written accounts and the fragmentary material evidence that the archaeology has produced. The religious life of Tenochtitlan was organized around the Templo Mayor and the surrounding ceremonial precinct, and the specific character of Aztec religious practice shaped the physical form of the city in fundamental ways. The Templo Mayor was not a single structure built in a single campaign. It was a structure rebuilt multiple times across the history of the city, each new construction encasing the previous one in the same way that a Russian nesting doll encloses its predecessors. The specific technique of encasing the previous pyramid within the new one preserved the earlier structures beneath each successive building phase, and when the modern excavations exposed the pyramid, it was found to contain a series of nested earlier structures, each one smaller and each one dating from an earlier period of the city's history. The excavation of the successive building phases of the Templo Mayor has been one of the more remarkable archaeological achievements of late 20th century Mexican archaeology. The specific rituals that took place at the Templo Mayor and at the more than 70 other sacred buildings that occupied the ceremonial precinct are documented in the combination of the Spanish accounts and the surviving Aztec pictorial manuscripts. The sacrificial rituals, in which prisoners of war and other individuals were killed at the summit of the pyramid, were the most visible and the most discussed aspect of Aztec religion in the Spanish sources and in subsequent historical writing. The scale of these sacrifices, and the specific relationship between human sacrifice and the agricultural and cosmic order that the Mexica religion was designed to maintain, have been the subject of sustained scholarly debate, with estimates of the annual number of sacrifices ranging from hundreds to tens of thousands. The archaeological evidence for the sacrificial rituals includes the massive offering deposits found at the base of the Templo Mayor and within its successive building phases. These deposits contain extraordinary assemblages of objects: coral and sea creatures from the Gulf Coast, turquoise mosaic objects from western Mexico, greenstone figures and masks of great antiquity, obsidian blades, ceramic vessels, and the bones of sacrificed animals and in some cases of human individuals. The specific composition of the offering deposits and the specific spatial relationships between different categories of offering and the architectural features of the pyramid give a picture of a ritual tradition of considerable organizational complexity. The ritual calendar of the Aztec world, with its combination of the 365-day solar calendar and the 260-day ritual calendar and the larger 52-year cycle in which both calendars completed simultaneously, organized the religious life of the city in a temporal framework of considerable sophistication, and the specific festivals that marked the different periods of the calendrical cycle each required specific ritual activities, specific food and cloth offerings, and specific participation by different categories of the population. The economy of Tenochtitlan was organized around the tribute system that extracted goods from the subject polities of the Triple Alliance and around the market system centered on the Great Market at Tlatelolco. The tribute lists that survive in the Aztec pictorial manuscripts and in the colonial period document known as the Matricula de Tributos give a detailed picture of the specific quantities and categories of goods that flowed into the Triple Alliance capitals from across the empire. The tribute included agricultural produce, cloth, featherwork, gold, jade, turquoise, amber, rubber, cacao, live animals and animal products, and the labor of subject communities for specific construction and maintenance projects. The scale of the tribute system, aggregated across the more than 500 polities that the Aztec sources list as tribute payers, gave the Triple Alliance capitals access to an enormous variety and quantity of goods from across a large geographic area. The market of Tlatelolco, which the Spanish accounts consistently describe as one of the most impressive things they saw in the Aztec world, was the commercial hub through which much of this material was exchanged. The market operated under the supervision of specific market judges who settled commercial disputes and enforced the quality standards that made the market a reliable venue for exchange. The specific organization of the market into sections for different categories of goods, each with its own established location and its own established price conventions, was a form of commercial standardization that the Spanish accounts found remarkable in comparison with the less organized markets of the contemporary European world. The long-distance trade networks that supplied the Tenochtitlan markets with goods from distant regions were managed by a specific class of specialized merchants known as the Poctica, who organized trading expeditions to distant parts of Mesoamerica, carried goods that were not produced in the basin of Mexico, and operated under a specific legal and social framework that gave them special privileges and special obligations within the Aztec social structure. The Poctica were not simply commercial operators. They also served as intelligence agents of the Aztec state in the distant regions they visited, and their commercial activities were intertwined with the political and military interests of the empire in ways that the surviving sources document in some detail. The Chinampa's agriculture that supplied the food base of the city was organized in a system that combined individual household production with specific obligations of labor and tribute to the state. The specific management of the water levels in the Chinampa channels, the maintenance of the willow trees whose roots stabilized the Chinampa edges, and the organization of the labor required to construct new Chinampas as the city grew required a degree of collective management that the sources document only indirectly but that the physical evidence of the surviving Chinampa landscape makes clear was highly organized. The social organization of the Aztec Empire was hierarchical and complex, with the emperor at its apex and a graduated structure of nobles, priests, warriors, commoners, and enslaved people below him. The Aztec emperor, or Huitzilopochtli, the Great Speaker, was the supreme political and military authority of the Triple Alliance, though the specific constitutional relationship between the rulers of the three allied city-states and the relative authority of each was more complex than simple descriptions of the empire as a single state with a single ruler suggest. The specific protocol of the Aztec court, visible in the accounts of the Spanish visitors who were received by Moctezuma, involved an elaborate set of ceremonial conventions that expressed the divine character of the ruler and the specific hierarchy of status among the people admitted to his presence. The Spanish accounts of their reception by Moctezuma describe the specific physical gestures of respect required by the Aztec court protocol, including the avoidance of direct eye contact and the specific sequence of bowing and greeting that regulated the approach to the imperial presence. Was the supreme political and military authority of the Triple Alliance. Though the specific constitutional relationship between the rulers of the three allied city-states and the relative authority of each was more complex than simple descriptions of the empire as a single state with a single ruler suggest. The specific mechanisms of imperial succession, which involved selection by a council of senior nobles rather than simple hereditary transmission from father to son, gave the Aztec political system a specific character that distinguished it from both European hereditary monarchies and from the simple military dictatorships that European observers sometimes assumed it to be. The Aztec nobility, the Pipiltin, were a hereditary class whose membership was defined by birth, whose members held the administrative and religious offices of the state, and whose distinctive clothing, housing, and behavior were encoded in the sumptuary laws that regulated the specific material expression of social status in the Aztec world. The specific visual culture of the Aztec elite, visible in the featherwork, the turquoise mosaic objects, and the elaborate textiles that were the specific material markers of high status, was the product of craft traditions of extraordinary technical accomplishment, and the objects that survive from the pre-conquest period in museum collections around the world give a sense of the specific aesthetic character of the Aztec elite material culture. The commoner population, the mass of whales, constituted the majority of the Aztec world's population and were organized in the calpulli, the corporate residential and kinship groups that were the basic unit of Aztec social and administrative organization. The calpulli owned land collectively, administered local religious and educational institutions, organized the labor obligations of their members to the state, and maintained the specific social networks through which ordinary Aztec life was conducted. The specific character of the calpulli system, and the specific degree of autonomy that commoner communities retained within the hierarchical framework of the Aztec state, are questions that the scholarship has addressed in productive ways without reaching a complete consensus. The Poctica merchants occupied a specific and somewhat anomalous position in the Aztec social hierarchy. Officially classified as commoners, they had accumulated sufficient wealth and social prestige through their commercial activities to have developed a separate social identity with its own specific institutions, its own patron deity, and its own specific privileges and obligations that placed them in a position between the nobility and the ordinary commoner class. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was one of the more consequential events in the political history of the Americas, and its specific character, the combination of military force, epidemic disease, and political alliance, shaped the form that the conquest took and the nature of the civilization that replaced the Aztec Empire. The Spanish expedition that arrived on the Gulf Coast in 1519 under the command of Hernán Cortés was a force of approximately 500 soldiers and 16 horses, a force entirely inadequate to conquer an empire of several million people by military means alone. The specific role of the Tlaxcalans and other indigenous allies in the conquest of Tenochtitlan is one of the more important and more frequently underemphasized dimensions of the conquest story. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec expansion for generations and had maintained their independence at the cost of being cut off from the trade networks that the Aztec Empire controlled. Their alliance with the Spanish, which was a pragmatic decision based on the specific political circumstances of 1519 rather than a simple submission to the newcomers, was essential to the military success of the conquest and shaped the specific form that the colonial order took in the decades after the fall of the city. Under the command of Hernán Cortés was a force of approximately 500 soldiers and 16 horses, a force entirely inadequate to conquer an empire of several million people by military means alone. The specific reasons why the conquest succeeded are multiple and have been extensively analyzed by historians, but the primary factors include the catastrophic impact of epidemic disease on the Aztec population, the willingness of the many people subject to the Triple Alliance to ally with the Spanish in order to escape the tribute obligations and the military predations of the empire, and the specific political and military mistakes made by the Aztec leadership in its initial dealings with the Spanish force. The siege of Tenochtitlan, which lasted from May to August of 1521, was the decisive military engagement of the conquest. The Spanish forces, supported by a large army of Tlaxcalan and other indigenous allies who had historical grievances against the Triple Alliance, surrounded the city and systematically destroyed it block by block as they advanced. The lake, which had been the city's primary defensive advantage, became a trap as the causeways were controlled by the Spanish and their allies, preventing the resupply of the besieged population. The smallpox epidemic that had swept through the city in the preceding year had already killed large numbers of the defenders, including the emperor who had succeeded Moctezuma, and the combination of epidemic disease, military siege, starvation, and the destruction of the water supply reduced the city's resistance to the point of collapse. The surrender of the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, on August 13, 1521, marked the formal end of the Aztec Empire. The destruction of Tenochtitlan was extensive. The fighting had reduced much of the city to rubble, and the deliberate destruction of the temples and the ceremonial architecture by the Spanish and their indigenous allies was part of a systematic effort to erase the physical markers of the defeated religion and the defeated political order. The stones of the ancient buildings were used in the construction of the new colonial city, and the symbolic replacement of the Aztec sacred space by the institutions of the Spanish colonial order, the cathedral over the Great Temple, the government palace over the imperial palace, was both practically efficient and symbolically complete. The colonial city of Mexico that was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan became the capital of New Spain and eventually the largest city in the Americas, and its specific relationship to the ancient city beneath it shaped both the physical character of the modern metropolis and the specific challenges of the archaeology that operates within it. The Spanish decision to build the new city directly on the site of the old one was driven by several considerations. The infrastructure of the island city, including the causeways and the drainage systems and the organized street plan of the ancient city, provided a foundation for the new construction. The symbolic replacement of the Aztec capital by the Spanish colonial capital communicated a specific message of political and religious succession that the colonial authorities valued. And the practical considerations of building in an already organized urban landscape were more attractive than the alternative of starting from scratch in an entirely new location. The colonial city grew steadily across the 16th and 17th centuries, and the lake that had once surrounded the island gradually shrank as drainage works progressively reduced its extent. The Chinampas to the south of the original island became agricultural land and eventually urban neighborhoods as the city expanded. The surrounding mountains, which had defined the specific enclosed quality of the Basin of Mexico landscape, remained, but the lake that had given the landscape its distinctive character disappeared by degrees as the drainage works of the colonial period and the subsequent centuries converted the lake bed into the flat urban plain of the modern city. The specific problem of subsidence, which affects Mexico City in a way that few other major cities experience, is a direct consequence of the drainage of the lake. The fine-grained lacustrine sediments that form the geological foundation of the city are compressing as the water table drops, and the different rates of compression in different parts of the city, reflecting the specific character of the sediments and the specific history of groundwater extraction, produce differential subsidence that tilts and cracks buildings in ways that are both visually dramatic and structurally problematic. The ancient building remains beneath the modern city are being affected by the same subsidence, and the specific challenges of excavating in a subsiding, waterlogged environment are among the more formidable aspects of the archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan. the specific character of the colonial urban planning that replaced the ancient city, and the specific decisions that shaped the modern street grid and the modern building patterns above the ancient remains, are themselves a form of archaeological evidence for the ancient city. The routes of the ancient causeways, preserved in the broad avenues of the colonial center, the locations of the ancient temples, preserved in the specific positions of the colonial churches that replaced them, and the general organization of the ancient ceremonial precinct, preserved in the spatial logic of the Zocalo and its surrounding blocks, all encode information about the ancient city in the geography of the modern one. The rediscovery of the ancient city beneath Mexico City has proceeded through a series of accidental finds and deliberate excavations that span the 3 centuries since the colonial period. The most significant single event in the modern archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan was the accidental discovery in February 1978 of a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered body of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui during excavation work for an electrical utility near the cathedral. The specific character of the Coyolxauhqui stone, which depicts the goddess in a state of dismemberment consistent with the Aztec mythological account of her death at the hands of her brother Huitzilopochtli at the moment of his birth, gave the discovery its immediate significance for the understanding of the Templo Mayor. The stone was found at the base of what turned out to be the Templo Mayor's main facade, in the position where the mythological narrative required it to be, and its discovery confirmed the location of the ancient pyramid in a way that subsequently validated the entire archaeological program. Was the accidental discovery in February 1978 of a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered body of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui during excavation work for an electrical utility near the cathedral. The specific significance of the Coyolxauhqui stone, which was immediately recognized as evidence for the location of the Templo Mayor, led to the decision to establish the Templo Mayor Archaeological Project and to excavate the area around the ancient pyramid. The excavation, directed by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, produced one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Mexico in the 20th century. The successive building phases of the Templo Mayor, with their associated offering deposits and their architectural details, were exposed for the first time in more than 450 years. The earlier accidental discoveries of ancient Tenochtitlan material had been accumulating since the colonial period. The Great Sun Stone, sometimes misleadingly called the Aztec calendar, was discovered in 1790 during renovation work in the main square. The Stone of Tizoc, another major Aztec monument, was found in the same year and in the same location. The excavation work for the Mexico City metro system, which began in the 1960s, produced numerous Aztec period finds along the routes of the tunnels. Each discovery added to the picture of the ancient city, but the specific concentration of finds in the colonial center of the modern city, directly above the ceremonial precinct of Tenochtitlan, made the area around the main square the most productive zone for archaeological investigation. The ongoing excavation program at the Templo Mayor site, which has continued since 1978, has produced a growing body of evidence for the architecture, the ritual life, and the material culture of the ancient ceremonial center. The offering deposits in particular, which number in the hundreds of individual caches distributed throughout the different building phases of the pyramid, have produced an extraordinary range of objects from across the geographic extent of the Aztec world and beyond. And the analysis of these deposits has given researchers a detailed picture of the specific ritual activities and the specific cosmological frameworks that organized the religious life of the ancient capital. The specific archaeology of the Templo Mayor and of the broader ceremonial precinct in which it stood is producing evidence that is transforming the understanding of the Aztec world in important ways. The offering deposits recovered from the successive building phases of the Templo Mayor are one of the richest and most diverse archaeological assemblages from any pre-Columbian site in the Americas. The specific categories of objects represented in the deposits include imported marine fauna from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, greenstone objects of great antiquity that were already centuries old when they were deposited, and Teotihuacan-style masks that had been curated for generations before being placed in the offerings. The specific curation of ancient objects from earlier periods and cultures in the Templo Mayor offerings is one of the more intellectually interesting aspects of the assemblage. The Aztecs were apparently collecting and preserving objects from the ruins of Teotihuacan and other earlier sites, and depositing them in the offerings of their own great temple in ways that attributed to these ancient objects a specific ritual power and significance derived from their antiquity. The specific practice of collecting and ritually reusing ancient objects speaks to an Aztec understanding of the past as a source of sacred power that could be accessed and mobilized through specific ritual acts. Are one of the richest and most diverse archaeological assemblages from any pre-Columbian site in the Americas. The specific categories of objects represented in the deposits include imported marine fauna from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, greenstone objects of great antiquity that were already centuries old when they were deposited, Teotihuacan-style masks that had been curated for generations before being placed in the offerings, obsidian figures and blades, coral, seeds, animal bones, ceramic vessels, and rare earth pigments. The specific combination of these materials in individual caches, and the specific spatial relationship of each cache to the architectural features of the pyramid, gives a picture of the specific cosmological logic that organized the ritual deposition. The evidence for the specific species of marine fauna in the offering deposits is one of the more striking results of the natural science analysis of the Templo Mayor assemblages. The deposits include specimens of fish, coral, shells, sea mammals, and other marine organisms from both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, documenting the specific reach of the Aztec commercial and tribute networks and the specific symbolic importance of the ocean and its creatures in the Aztec cosmological tradition. The identification of specific species that can be attributed to specific geographic origins allows researchers to reconstruct the specific patterns of long-distance exchange that supplied the ritual needs of the ceremonial center. The bioarchaeological analysis of the human remains found in the offering deposits at the Templo Mayor has produced evidence for the specific character of the sacrificial rituals performed at the pyramid. The skeletal remains include both adult and juvenile individuals, and the specific patterns of modification visible in the bones, including evidence for the removal of soft tissues and the modification of the skeletal elements in specific ways, give a picture of the specific ritual procedures associated with sacrificial burial that supplements the information from the pictorial manuscripts and the Spanish accounts. The ongoing excavation of areas adjacent to the Templo Mayor, including the investigation of the surrounding ceremonial precinct and of the specific buildings that flank the Great Temple on all sides, is expanding the picture of the ancient center beyond the pyramid itself. The discovery in 2019 of the Calmecac, the priestly school associated with the Templo Mayor, and the ongoing investigation of the palace complex of Moctezuma that lies beneath the National Palace adjacent to the archaeological zone, are among the more recent significant developments in the investigation of the ancient city. The mystery of what lies beneath the modern city, beyond the areas that have been excavated, is one of the most productive and most frustrating aspects of the archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan. The specific limitation of the archaeology is imposed by the existence of the modern city above. Every area where ancient remains might be investigated is covered by occupied buildings, active streets, and functioning infrastructure that cannot be disturbed for archaeological purposes without enormous economic and practical cost. The specific creativity required to do archaeology in this context, finding ways to extract maximum information from the limited windows of access that the modern city provides, has produced methodological innovations in Mexican urban archaeology that have been influential beyond the specific context of Mexico City. The development of rapid response protocols for construction excavations, the systematic integration of archaeological monitoring into urban infrastructure projects, and the application of non-invasive survey methods to urban archaeological contexts have all been developed or refined in the specific challenge of investigating ancient Tenochtitlan. The ancient city lies directly beneath the living city, and the specific areas where excavation has been possible are the areas where modern construction or renovation has created access to the ancient layers. The foundation excavations for new buildings, the tunneling for infrastructure, the deliberate archaeological projects at sites where modern structures have been cleared. The model of ancient Tenochtitlan that the scholars have reconstructed from the combination of the Spanish accounts, the Aztec pictorial manuscripts, the colonial maps, and the archaeological evidence is a detailed and specific one in some dimensions and radically incomplete in others. The ceremonial center is reasonably well understood because the Templo Mayor excavations have produced direct evidence for its character. The market district at Tlatelolco is documented in the accounts of the Spanish visitors and partially investigated archaeologically. But the residential areas of the ancient city, where the majority of the population lived and where the specific material culture of ordinary Aztec daily life was generated, are almost entirely inaccessible beneath the modern streets. The specific technology of non-invasive subsurface investigation, including ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and various geophysical methods, is being applied to the Mexico City urban area in systematic programs that are beginning to map the extent and the character of the ancient remains beneath the modern streets without disturbing them. The results of these surveys are revealing the specific depth and the specific preservation state of ancient Tenochtitlan material beneath different areas of the modern city, and are identifying specific locations where future targeted excavation could produce the most significant results. The discovery in 2020 of a significant concentration of human remains in the area near the cathedral, including what appears to be the Huitzilopochtli, the great skull rack that stood in the ceremonial precinct and that the Spanish accounts describe as one of the more disturbing features of the ancient city, is among the more recent dramatic finds from the ongoing investigation of the ancient ceremonial center. The specific scale and character of this find is still being assessed, but it is adding important new evidence to the picture of the ancient ceremonial practices of Tenochtitlan. The comparison between Tenochtitlan and the other great capitals of the pre-Columbian Americas illuminates the specific character of the Aztec achievement and its place in the broader history of American urbanism. The most direct comparison within Mesoamerica is with Teotihuacan, the great ancient city in the northern basin of Mexico that reached its peak of development between approximately 100 and 650 CE. Teotihuacan was a planned city of extraordinary scale, with its great central avenue, its pyramids of the sun and the moon, and its organized residential compounds housing a population estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 people. The specific relationship between Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan, mediated through 7 centuries of abandonment and the specific reverence that the Aztecs showed toward the ruins of the older city, is one of the more interesting themes in the long history of the Basin of Mexico. The Aztecs did not simply inherit the traditions of Teotihuacan. They adopted them selectively, treating specific elements of the older tradition as sources of sacred legitimacy while developing their own distinct cultural and political forms in ways that were shaped by but not simply derived from their ancient predecessor. The great ancient city in the northern basin of Mexico that reached its peak of development between approximately 100 and 650 CE. When Tenochtitlan was founded in the 14th century, Teotihuacan had been abandoned for more than 7 centuries, but its ruins were still present in the landscape and were understood by the Aztecs as a sacred place, the city where the gods had gathered at the beginning of the current cosmic era. The specific reverence with which the Aztecs treated the ruins of Teotihuacan, and the specific objects from that ancient city that appear in the offering deposits of the Templo Mayor, documents a relationship between the Aztec capital and its ancient predecessor that gives the archaeology of both sites a connected dimension. The comparison with the Inca capital of Cusco in Peru, which was developing as a major imperial center at roughly the same time as Tenochtitlan was reaching its height, is also instructive. Both Tenochtitlan and Cusco were the capitals of expanding empires organized around specific religious and political traditions. Both were characterized by elaborate ceremonial architecture and by sophisticated administrative systems, and both were destroyed by Spanish military forces within a generation of the Spanish arrival in their respective regions. The specific similarities and differences between the two imperial capitals give a sense of the range of forms that American urbanism had achieved by the early 16th century, and the specific contrasts between the lake city of central Mexico and the mountain city of the Peruvian highlands reflect the specific environmental and cultural conditions that shaped each tradition. The comparison with Cahokia, the great pre-Columbian city at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, which was at its height in the 11th and 12th centuries CE, gives a longer perspective on North American urbanism and places Tenochtitlan in a continental context of urban development that the standard accounts of pre-Columbian history sometimes fail to convey. The Americas in the period before European contact were a continent of genuine urban complexity, and Tenochtitlan was the largest and most elaborate expression of that complexity in the period immediately before the conquest. The specific experience of Mexico City today, as a living metropolis built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, gives the modern city a specific quality of layering that is visible to anyone who looks for it. The main square of Mexico City, the Zocalo, sits directly above the ancient ceremonial precinct of Tenochtitlan. The cathedral on its north side was built using stones from the ancient temples. The National Palace on its east side occupies the site of the Palace of Moctezuma. The specific experience of standing in the Zocalo and being aware of what lies beneath it, of the specific history that the square both marks and conceals, is one that the archaeology of the Templo Mayor has made available to visitors in a way that was not possible before the 1978 excavations. The ability to walk from the modern square into the ancient ceremonial precinct through the Templo Mayor archaeological site, passing from the living city into the ruins of the city it replaced within the space of a few meters, is an experience of historical layering that is unique to Mexico City among the major cities of the world. Of Tenochtitlan. The cathedral on its north side was built using stones from the ancient temples. The Templo Mayor archaeological site, which opens onto the square from the northeast corner, allows visitors to walk through the exposed ruins of the ancient pyramid literally adjacent to the living colonial and modern city. The specific spatial relationship between the ancient ceremonial center and the modern civic center is not incidental or coincidental. It was designed by the Spanish colonial authorities as a specific act of political and religious replacement, and it has given the Zocalo and its surroundings a quality of historical density that few urban spaces anywhere in the world can match. The experience of walking through the streets of the colonial center of Mexico City and encountering the evidence of the ancient city is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a carved stone reused in a colonial wall, its Aztec iconography clearly visible despite its reutilization in a different context. Sometimes it is the glass floor of a restaurant that has been built over an archaeological excavation, giving diners a view of the ancient street level below them. Sometimes it is the specific tilt of a colonial building that reflects the differential subsidence of the lake bed beneath, a subsidence caused by the same drainage works that buried the lake and with it the specific lacustrine environment of the ancient city. The Museum of the Templo Mayor, which occupies the block adjacent to the archaeological site, holds the specific objects recovered from the offerings and the structures of the ancient pyramid in a collection that is one of the most important concentrations of pre-Columbian material culture in the world. The Coyolxauhqui stone, the great disk whose discovery in 1978 initiated the modern phase of Templo Mayor archaeology, is displayed in the museum in the specific orientation in which it was found, flat on the ground at the base of the pyramid, in the position in which it was placed by the ancient priests who completed the ritual that the stone depicts. The living culture of Mexico City, and of Mexico more broadly, maintains a relationship with the Aztec past that is more complex and more present than the relationship of most modern nations to their pre-colonial predecessors. The Mexica tradition is not simply a historical subject in Mexico. It is a dimension of contemporary national identity, present in the iconography of the national flag, in the name of the country itself, and in a specific strand of cultural consciousness that connects the present to the pre-colonial past in ways that European conquest interrupted but did not permanently sever. What makes Tenochtitlan different from other lost ancient cities is that it is not lost in the conventional sense. Most of the ancient cities that archaeology investigates are cities that were abandoned, that fell into ruin, and that were eventually covered by the natural processes of sedimentation, vegetation, or sand drift. The city is lost because it was left, and the archaeology recovers it from the natural burial that preserved it. The specific modality of Tenochtitlan's disappearance, as a city that was deliberately built over rather than naturally buried, gives its archaeology a different quality from the archaeology of conventionally lost cities. The relationship between the ancient city and the modern one is not simply the relationship between past and present, but the relationship between a city that was destroyed and a city that was built to replace it, and the archaeology of one is inseparable from the archaeology of the other. That fell into ruin, and that were eventually covered by the natural processes of sedimentation, vegetation, or sand drift. Tenochtitlan was not abandoned and not naturally buried. It was deliberately destroyed and deliberately built over, and the city that replaced it is still there, still growing, still covering and revealing the ancient layers in the specific ways that a living city covers and reveals its own history. This gives the archaeology of Tenochtitlan a specific character that is different from the archaeology of conventionally lost cities. Every discovery is an interruption of the modern city rather than an excavation of a site from which modern habitation has been absent. Every decision about whether and where to excavate is a decision that must be negotiated with the interests and the infrastructure of a metropolis of 20 million people. Every new find is a negotiation between the claims of the ancient city and the claims of the modern one. The specific tension between archaeological preservation and urban development that characterizes the archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan is not unique to Mexico City. The same tension exists in Rome, in Istanbul, in Jerusalem, in London, and in every other major city built on significant archaeological remains. But the specific density and the specific significance of the Tenochtitlan remains, combined with the specific scale and the specific pressures of modern Mexico City, give the tension a particularly acute character. The ongoing excavation program at the Templo Mayor and the systematic use of non-invasive survey methods to investigate the broader urban area without disturbing the modern city above represents the specific approach that Mexican archaeology has developed for managing this tension. It is an approach that sacrifices comprehensiveness for sustainability, that accepts the limitation imposed by the living city as the necessary condition of any investigation at all, and that works within those limitations to recover as much as possible from the specific opportunities that the modern city creates. It is not the approach that would be taken if the ancient city were accessible in the way that Pompeii or Angkor are accessible, but it is the approach that the specific situation of Tenochtitlan requires. The specific legacy of the Aztec Empire in the cultures and the populations of modern Mexico is one of the most complex questions in the history of the Americas. The Spanish conquest did not erase the indigenous population of Mexico, though it reduced it catastrophically through epidemic disease, warfare, and the specific hardships of the colonial economic system. The indigenous population of Mexico, estimated at perhaps 10 million at the time of the conquest, had been reduced by perhaps 80 to 90% within a century, through a combination of mortality from epidemic diseases to which they had no prior immunity and the specific conditions of the colonial economy that made many forms of survival extremely difficult. The subsequent recovery of the indigenous population and the specific mixing of indigenous, Spanish, and African genetic and cultural traditions that produced the specific character of Mexican culture is the demographic and cultural history that connects the ancient world of Tenochtitlan to the modern world of Mexico City. The Nahuatl language, which was the primary language of the Aztec Empire and which is still spoken by approximately 1.5 million people in Mexico today, is one of the most direct connections between the ancient city and the present. The specific persistence of the Nahuatl language across 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial transformation is itself a remarkable fact about the resilience of indigenous cultural traditions in the face of sustained external pressure. The communities that maintained Nahuatl as a living language through the colonial period and into the present were not simply preserving a communication system. They were maintaining a specific form of cultural continuity with the pre-colonial world that the language encodes, including the specific names for places and plants and concepts that connect the present to a past that the conquest attempted to displace but could not entirely erase, and which is still spoken by approximately 1.5 million people in Mexico today, is one of the most direct connections between the ancient city and the present. The specific linguistic heritage of the Aztec world is visible not only in the continuing presence of Nahuatl speakers, but in the hundreds of words of Nahuatl origin that have passed into Spanish and from Spanish into English and other world languages. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, and dozens of other food terms in common use in languages around the world are words of Nahuatl origin, and their presence in the global vocabulary is a linguistic trace of the specific culinary tradition of the Aztec world that survived the conquest through the specific persistence of the food plants and the food culture that it had developed. The political use of the Aztec heritage in modern Mexico has been one of the more complex dimensions of the relationship between the present and the pre-colonial past. The Mexican national identity, shaped in the period of the 19th century independence movement and elaborated through the 20th century period of the Mexican Revolution and its cultural aftermath, drew explicitly on the Aztec past as a source of indigenous authenticity that distinguished Mexico from its European colonial heritage. The specific valorization of the Aztec tradition in the murals of Diego Rivera and other artists of the Mexican muralist movement, and the specific incorporation of Aztec iconography into the symbols of the Mexican state, reflect a particular ideological choice about which dimensions of the Mexican past to claim as foundational. The relationship between this ideological choice and the specific experience of the millions of indigenous Mexicans who are the direct cultural descendants of the peoples the Aztecs conquered and dominated is one of the more productive tensions in contemporary Mexican cultural and political life. The Aztec Empire was not simply the glorious past of all Mexicans. It was also the specific political order that extracted tribute from and exercised military power over a large number of other indigenous peoples, and the specific experience of those peoples and their descendants is part of the same story. The new excavations at Tenochtitlan, accelerated by major infrastructure projects and by systematic archaeological survey, are producing discoveries of considerable significance. The ongoing investigation of the area beneath and around the National Palace, which sits on the east side of the Zocalo directly above the site of the Palace of Moctezuma, has been one of the more productive zones of recent investigation. The specific character of the Palace of Moctezuma, as described by the Spanish visitors who were housed within it in the months before the conquest, included not only the residential and administrative spaces of the imperial court but a botanical garden, a zoological collection of birds and other animals, and a series of pools and aviaries that documented the Aztec interest in the natural world in a form that had no parallel in the European experience of the period. The recovery of any physical trace of these installations from beneath the National Palace would be one of the more dramatic archaeological discoveries in the history of Tenochtitlan research, which sits on the east side of the Zocalo directly above the site of the Palace of Moctezuma, has been one of the more productive zones of recent investigation. The foundation excavations for renovation work at the palace have produced evidence for the architecture and the material culture of the imperial palace that was described in such vivid terms by the Spanish visitors of 1519 and 1520, and the specific discoveries are beginning to give material substance to the accounts that had previously been available only in the literary sources. The discovery in 2017 of the Huitzilopochtli, the great skull rack of the ceremonial precinct, began with the identification of a concentration of human remains near the cathedral and has been progressively revealed as one of the larger collections of ritualized human remains from any pre-Columbian site in Mesoamerica. The specific character of the Tzompantli as an architectural installation, in which the skulls of sacrificial victims were displayed on horizontal poles above the heads of passers-by in the ceremonial precinct, is described in the Spanish accounts and depicted in the Aztec pictorial manuscripts. But the direct archaeological evidence for the structure itself has been a significant addition to the material record of the ancient city. The systematic application of remote sensing methods to the Mexico City urban area, including the use of ground-penetrating radar in strategic locations where the surface is accessible, has been producing an increasingly detailed map of the ancient remains beneath the modern streets. The results are revealing the specific extent and the specific preservation state of ancient Tenochtitlan material in different areas of the colonial center, and are guiding the planning of future targeted excavations in locations where the evidence suggests the greatest concentration of archaeologically significant remains. The analysis of the natural science evidence from the Templo Mayor offerings, including the DNA analysis of the human and animal remains and the isotopic analysis of the materials used in the offerings, is producing information about the specific geographic origins of the people and the materials that were used in the rituals of the ancient ceremonial center. The results are connecting the specific ritual practices of the Templo Mayor to the broader geographic world of the Aztec Empire in ways that the purely typological analysis of the offering materials could not achieve. What modern archaeology has established about ancient Tenochtitlan over the past several decades has substantially revised the understanding of the Aztec world that the older scholarship, dominated by the interpretation of the Spanish colonial sources, had produced. The shift from reliance on the Spanish accounts as the primary sources for the understanding of Aztec civilization to an approach that integrates the Spanish accounts with the indigenous pictorial manuscripts, the archaeological evidence, and the evidence from the Nahuatl language itself has been the most fundamental methodological change in the field of Aztec studies in the 20th century. The specific contribution of the indigenous Nahuatl language sources to the understanding of the Aztec world is one that the scholarship has been working to fully integrate for several decades. The colonial period Nahuatl documents, including the extraordinary ethnographic compilations of Fray Bernardino de Sahagun and his indigenous collaborators, the legal and administrative records produced by Nahuatl-speaking scribes, and the historical narratives recorded in the decades after the conquest by indigenous historians, give access to the Aztec world from a perspective that is qualitatively different from the Spanish accounts and that is essential for any complete understanding of the pre-conquest civilization. For the understanding of Aztec civilization to an approach that integrates the Spanish accounts with the indigenous pictorial manuscripts, the archaeological evidence, and the evidence from the Nahuatl language itself has been the most fundamental methodological change in the field of Aztec studies in the 20th century. The specific picture of Aztec civilization that emerges from this more complete and more critically evaluated evidence base is both more complex and more sympathetic than the picture produced by the colonial sources alone, which were written from the perspective of the conquerors and shaped by the specific ideological agenda of justifying the conquest. The archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor excavations has been particularly important in revising the understanding of the specific character of Aztec religious practice. The offering deposits, with their extraordinary diversity of materials and their specific spatial organization, give a picture of a ritual tradition of considerable theological sophistication that the Spanish accounts, which tended to reduce the complexity of Aztec religion to the single dramatic element of human sacrifice, could not adequately convey. The specific cosmological logic of the offerings, in which specific categories of objects were associated with specific deities and specific aspects of the Aztec cosmic order, is becoming increasingly visible as the analysis of the assemblages progresses. The ethno-historical research that has developed in parallel with the archaeological work, drawing on the Nahuatl language documents produced in the colonial period by indigenous scribes and scholars who preserved much of the knowledge of the pre-conquest tradition, has given researchers access to dimensions of Aztec culture that the purely archaeological evidence cannot provide. The specific social practices, the specific legal traditions, the specific ritual knowledge, and the specific historical narratives that the Nahuatl documents preserve are being integrated with the archaeological evidence to produce a more complete picture of the Aztec world than either body of evidence alone could generate. The development of Mexican archaeology as a professional discipline with its own trained scholars, its own research institutions, and its own interpretive traditions has been one of the more significant developments in the study of the ancient city in the 20th century. The specific perspectives that Mexican archaeologists and historians bring to the study of the ancient capital of their own cultural heritage are different from the perspectives that dominated the field when European and North American scholars were its primary practitioners. And the integration of these different perspectives has enriched the understanding of Tenochtitlan in ways that the earlier scholarship could not achieve. What remains uncertain about ancient Tenochtitlan encompasses some of the most fundamental questions about the civilization's scale, its internal organization, and the specific character of its daily life. The population of the city at its height is one of the more actively debated questions in the scholarship. The estimates range from perhaps 100,000 to 300,000 people, with the most frequently cited figure being approximately 200,000 to 250,000. The specific methodology used to derive each estimate, whether from the extent of the urban area and assumed population densities, from the carrying capacity of the Chinampa agricultural system, or from the specific tribute requirements that imply a specific minimum population, produces different results. And the genuine uncertainty reflects the specific challenges of estimating the population of a city that no longer exists in its original form and whose physical extent is largely inaccessible. Beneath the modern urban fabric, the specific organization of political authority within the Triple Alliance, and the specific constitutional relationship between the rulers of the three allied city-states, is another area of genuine uncertainty. The scholarship has debated the degree to which the Triple Alliance was a genuine confederation of three equal partners or a system in which the Mexica of Tenochtitlan exercised a dominant authority over the nominally equal partners of Texcoco and Tlacopan, and the specific evidence for both positions is sufficient to sustain the debate without resolving it. The specific character of daily life for the majority of the city's population, the commoner households and the artisan workshops and the market traders whose lives are not directly documented in the elite sources that dominate the literary and pictorial record, is one of the areas where the archaeology has the most potential to contribute evidence that the documentary sources cannot provide. The specific material culture of ordinary Aztec households, visible in the ceramics and the food remains and the domestic architecture of the residential areas, is largely inaccessible beneath the modern city, and the picture of Aztec daily life that can be reconstructed from the available evidence is inevitably skewed toward the elite and the ceremonial dimensions of the ancient world. The specific fate of the population of Tenochtitlan during and after the conquest is another area of genuine uncertainty. The specific numbers of people who died in the siege, who survived and remained in the city, who fled to surrounding communities, and who eventually returned to participate in the construction of the colonial city are not determinable from the available evidence with any precision, and the specific continuity and discontinuity between the ancient and the colonial populations of the Mexico City basin is a question that the scholarship continues to investigate. The specific uncertainty about the nature of the Triple Alliance as a political system and about the specific constitutional relationship between its three member states is one that reflects the genuine ambiguity of the pre-Columbian sources on this question. The indigenous pictorial manuscripts and the Nahuatl language documents from the colonial period give somewhat different pictures of the relationship between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, and the synthesis of these different perspectives into a coherent account of the Triple Alliance political system is one of the ongoing challenges of the scholarship. Tenochtitlan changes how we think about the Americas before European contact and about the scale and the sophistication of the indigenous civilizations that the conquest encountered and overwhelmed. The most immediate implication is about the specific scale of what was lost. The destruction of Tenochtitlan was not simply the military defeat of a political entity. It was the deliberate erasure of a major urban civilization, the systematic replacement of its sacred spaces and its administrative institutions by the institutions of the colonial order, and the catastrophic reduction of its population through epidemic disease and the specific hardships of the colonial economy. The scale of this destruction, and the specific character of what was lost, is only now becoming fully apparent as the archaeology recovers fragments of the ancient city from beneath the modern one. The broader implication is about the pre-Columbian Americas as a zone of genuine historical significance and genuine urban complexity. The Americas in 1519 were not the largely empty wilderness that the colonial mythology of the conquest suggested. They were a continent of large populations, diverse cultures, complex political systems, and sophisticated cities, of which Tenochtitlan was the largest and most elaborate expression in the Western Hemisphere at that moment. Engaging seriously with what was there before the conquest, and what was lost in the conquest, is a moral and intellectual obligation that the scholarship is still in the process of fully discharging. The specific lesson of the Templo Mayor excavations is that the ancient city is recoverable, in fragments and in glimpses, through the patient work of archaeology operating within the constraints of the living city above. Each offering cache, each carved stone, each fragment of painted plaster recovered from beneath the streets of Mexico City is a piece of the picture of a civilization that the conquest attempted to erase but did not completely destroy. The specific persistence of the ancient city beneath the modern one, its continued presence in the layers below the streets and the buildings of the metropolis, is evidence that the erasure was incomplete, and that the recovery of what was there is not simply an academic exercise but a genuine act of historical justice. The ancient city is still there, beneath the feet of the 20 million people who walk the streets of Mexico City every day, deeper in some places and closer to the surface in others, waiting in the specific darkness of the urban basement for the next construction excavation or the next deliberate archaeological project to bring it back into the light. The specific significance of the ancient city for the identity of the modern city is not simply a matter of academic interest. The Templo Mayor, standing between the cathedral and the Zocalo in the heart of Mexico City, is a physical reminder that the modern city was built on the ruins of a civilization that it did not inherit in any simple or direct way, and that the relationship between the present and that past is one of the more complex and more consequential historical relationships in the Americas. The people of ancient Tenochtitlan were fully human in every sense, and the evidence they left behind gives access to the specific humanity of a civilization that the conquest came close to erasing entirely. The pictorial manuscripts that survive from the Aztec world, produced both before and shortly after the conquest, give a vivid picture of the specific visual culture and the specific organizational practices of the ancient city. The tribute lists, the ritual calendars, the historical narratives, and the cosmological diagrams that these manuscripts contain are the direct products of a specific intellectual and artistic tradition, and the specific individuals who produced them, the scribes and the priests and the historians of the Aztec state, were exercising specific intellectual skills of considerable sophistication in the service of a specific cultural tradition that they understood and valued. The Nahuatl poetry and literature that was preserved in the colonial period by indigenous scholars who transcribed the oral traditions of the pre-conquest world gives access to the emotional and aesthetic life of the ancient city in ways that the purely material evidence cannot provide. The specific poetry attributed to the philosopher King Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco, one of the Triple Alliance partners, deals with themes of mortality, beauty, and the specific pleasure of the world in ways that speak across 5 centuries of cultural change without requiring translation beyond the linguistic. The specific quality of a culture that produced this poetry alongside the pyramids and the tribute lists is a quality that the reduction of the Aztec world to its most dramatic and most alien elements, the human sacrifice and the warfare, consistently fails to convey. The market of Tlatelolco, as Bernal Diaz described it, was a place where 60,000 people came daily to buy and sell, where the noise of the commerce carried across the square, where the smell of the food stalls and the dye workshops and the herb sellers mingled in the specific way that large markets have mingled smells across all of human history. The specific people who traded in that market, the woman who sold cacao and the man who sold obsidian blades and the child who watched the performance of the street entertainers, these are the people whose lives the ancient city was built to sustain, and whose presence made it what the Spanish visitors described in terms of wonder and disbelief. The obsidian blades and the greenstone beads and the ceramic vessels and the featherwork that have been recovered from the offering deposits of the Templo Mayor are the physical traces of a world that was making specific things in specific ways for specific purposes. And the specific human skill and intention that went into each of them is as real and as genuine as the skill and the intention that went into any object made in any culture in any period of human history. The specific humanity of the ancient Tenochtitlan world is also visible in the poetry and the literature preserved in the Nahuatl documents of the colonial period. The specific tradition of philosophical and lyrical poetry that the Aztec world had developed, visible in the texts attributed to Nezahualcóyotl and other poet rulers of the pre-conquest period, is evidence for an intellectual and aesthetic tradition of considerable sophistication that the reduction of the Aztec world to its most dramatic and most alien elements consistently fails to convey. The central image of ancient Tenochtitlan is the image of the lake city in the morning, the causeways connecting the island to the mainland through the mist that rises from the water in the cool of the high-altitude dawn. It is a landscape that no longer exists. The lake is gone, drained across centuries of colonial and post-colonial drainage works, and the flat urban plain of Mexico City now covers the bed where it once lay. The causeways have become the broad avenues of the modern city, their routes approximately preserved in the street grid of the colonial center. The island has expanded beyond recognition into the continuous urban mass that now covers the former lake bed in every direction. But the image survives in the specific accounts of the people who saw it, who came over the mountains from the Gulf Coast and looked down at the basin in the morning light and saw the lake with the city on it and the causeways connecting city to shore and the mountains behind. Cortés described it in a letter to a king who would never see it. Diaz described it in a memoir written by an old man who had seen it young and had lived through its destruction and had spent decades trying to convey the specific quality of the experience to readers who would have to take it on faith. The Zócalo in the early morning, before the traffic and the crowds, has a specific quality of space and light that connects it obliquely to the ancient city that it replaced. The scale of the square, the way the mountains are visible beyond the buildings on its perimeter, the specific quality of the high-altitude light that makes the colors of the modern city vivid in the same way it would have made the colors of the ancient one vivid. These are the material continuities that connect the present to a past that the conquest attempted to make permanently inaccessible. The Templo Mayor is there, between the cathedral and the Zócalo, its stones exposed and its successive building phases visible in the bright Mexican sunlight that falls on the ancient architecture with the same quality it fell on it when the priests climbed to the summit for the last time before the Spanish forces reached the city. The specific stones of the pyramid, cut and fitted by specific hands more than 500 years ago, are still there, still in their positions, still holding the specific shape of the ancient sacred center in the heart of the modern city that was built to replace it. The specific relationship between the ancient city and the modern one, visible in the exposed stones of the Templo Mayor between the colonial cathedral and the modern government palace, is the most concentrated spatial expression of the historical layering that defines Mexico City as a place. It is a layering that is not simply archaeological but political and cultural, a layering of conquest and survival and transformation that is still actively unfolding in the contemporary life of the city and the country. The specific experience of the Templo Mayor at dawn, when the early light falls on the ancient stone from the east in the same direction it would have fallen in the time of the ancient city, is an experience of historical presence that the modern archaeological site makes available to anyone who makes the effort to arrive before the crowds. The ancient stones are cold in the early morning, and the colors of the carved surfaces are visible in the low-angle light in ways that the harsher illumination of midday obscures, and the specific quality of the encounter with the ancient city in those conditions is one that the millions of daily visitors to the Zócalo rarely have the opportunity to experience. The ongoing work of recovering ancient Tenochtitlan from beneath Mexico City is a scholarly, institutional, and political enterprise that operates within specific constraints and produces specific results. The Templo Mayor project, directed since its founding by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma and subsequently by a succession of Mexican archaeologists, has maintained a program of continuous excavation, analysis, and publication for more than 4 decades, producing one of the richest bodies of archaeological evidence from any pre-Columbian site in Mesoamerica. The specific institutional framework of the project, which combines the resources of the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia with the contributions of international research collaborators, has allowed a sustained long-term research program that has accumulated results across successive excavation seasons in ways that shorter-term projects could not achieve. The management of the Templo Mayor as both an active research site and a major tourist attraction is one of the organizational challenges that the project manages on a daily basis. The specific balance between the access that visitors need to make the site meaningful to the public that supports the museum and the protection that the ancient remains require to be preserved for ongoing research is a tension that the site management negotiates continuously, and the specific solutions developed at the Templo Mayor, including the combination of a museum with the outdoor archaeological site, have been influential in the design of similar projects elsewhere in Mexico and in Latin America more broadly. The political and cultural dimensions of the Templo Mayor project and of the broader enterprise of recovering ancient Tenochtitlan from beneath the modern city are inseparable from the specific political and cultural context of contemporary Mexico. The decision to give archaeological priority to the ancient Mexica capital and to manage its remains as a primary element of Mexican national heritage reflects specific choices about which dimensions of the Mexican past are most fundamental to contemporary national identity. These choices are not uncontested, and the specific relationship between the archaeology of Tenochtitlan and the experience of the many indigenous communities in Mexico who are not Mexica descendants is one that the field continues to navigate. The future of the archaeology of ancient Tenochtitlan will be shaped by the development of new non-invasive investigation methods, by the specific opportunities for excavation that future infrastructure development in the Mexico City Center will create, and by the ongoing analysis of the materials already recovered from the existing excavations. Each new season of work at the Templo Mayor produces new finds and new understanding, and the picture of the ancient city that the scholarship is assembling is becoming more detailed and more complete with each addition to the accumulated body of evidence. The lake is gone. The specific quality of the high-altitude light of the Basin of Mexico is still there, the clear brightness of 2,000 meters of elevation that makes the colors of the city vivid and the distances sharp. The mountains are still there, the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl visible on clear days above the urban haze to the southeast, the same volcanoes that the Spanish expedition crossed in 1519 when they descended from the pass and looked down at the lake and the city in the morning light. But the lake is gone, and the city that was built on the lake is gone, buried under the city that was built to replace it. The replacement is imperfect, as all replacements are. The ancient stones are in the cathedral and in the walls of the colonial buildings and in the foundations of the government palace, reused and repurposed but still physically present in the fabric of the city that covers them. The street grid of the colonial center preserves the approximate routes of the ancient causeways and the ancient street plan of the island city. The names of neighborhoods and streets and municipal districts carry the Nahuatl names of the ancient city's quarters in a linguistic persistence that the colonial authorities could not entirely erase. And beneath the streets, in the dark below the foundations of the modern buildings and the pipes of the modern infrastructure, the ancient city lies in its layers, deeper in some places and closer to the surface in others, more complete in some areas and more fragmentary in others. The archaeologists who work at the Templo Mayor and in the other locations where the ancient city is accessible are recovering it piece by piece, offering cache by offering cache, carved stone by carved stone. The picture they are assembling is of a city that was large and complex and beautiful and brutal, that housed hundreds of thousands of people in a landscape of canals and chinampas and ceremonial precincts, that conducted trade across 1,000 kilometers of mountain and forest and coastline, and that was destroyed in 2 years by a combination of military force, epidemic disease, and political alliance that the city's founders could not have imagined. The ancient city is still there. The evidence of it is still accumulating, in the analysis laboratories and the museum storerooms and the growing archive of the Templo Mayor project. And in the heart of the modern city, between the cathedral and the government palace and the great plaza where the people of Mexico City gather on Sundays, the exposed stones of the great temple are still standing in the morning light. The specific quality of the morning in the Zocalo, before the crowds arrive and the noise builds, has something of the quality of the ancient morning that the Spanish visitors described when they came down from the mountains and saw the lake and the city in the early light. The scale is different, the materials are different, the people are different. But the light is the same light, the mountains are the same mountains, and the deep historical presence of a civilization that was building one of the largest cities in the world while Europe was still in the early Renaissance is a presence that the exposed stones of the Templo Mayor make available to anyone who looks. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.